Today's reading from 1 Corinthians is one of those that has created confusion in the church. It's one of those places where Paul seems to create a universal, unyielding rule against women speaking in churches. It really provides a sort of Rorschach test where people tend to see in it what they want to see, confirming their own biases. But a closer examination reveals a more durable principle than simply a permanent prohibition against women speaking in churches. In fact, anyone who's been Presbyterian long enough will instantly recognize Paul's real underlying principle. Hello, I'm Stuart Baskin, pastor of First Presbyterian Church of Tyler, Texas, and this is your Daily Devotional for Thursday, October 14th, 2021. When we read Paul's letters today, it is important for us to remember that Paul did not understand himself to be writing Scripture. He was just writing letters, mostly to individual congregations around Asia Minor, and he was always addressing issues faced in the first century, often providing advice that is not so much universal to the church forever, but specific to that time and place. Case in point, in today's reading, Paul gives specific advice about how worship ought to be conducted. His advice seems largely dated to us because our worship practices are very different from those in the early church. His specific concern is the place of speaking in tongues and prophecy in the church. Let's listen in on his advice to the Corinthians on this score. And remember, he's writing to a congregation that is experiencing significant conflict, apparently caused by people who thought that their spiritual gifts made them superior to their fellow Christians. Here's how Paul addresses the issue when it comes to worship. He says, "If anyone speaks in a tongue, let there be only 2 or at most 3, and each in turn. Let one interpret. But if there is no one to interpret, let them be silent in church and speak to themselves and to God. Let 2 or 3 prophets speak, and let the others weigh in on what is said. If a revelation is made to someone else sitting nearby, let the first person be silent. For you can all prophesy one by one, so that all may learn and all may be encouraged. And the spirits of prophets are subject to the prophets. For God is a God not of disorder, but of peace." See, if this advice seems a little strange to you, don't worry. In churches like ours, we don't reserve time for spontaneous outbursts of speaking in tongues or prophecy by folks in the pews. We follow a much more planned and orderly format in our services. Now, you could certainly argue that we ought to be open to prophecy and speaking in tongues, but it's simply not how we do things. But because Paul addresses these things and assumes them to be part of worship, does that mean we are commanded to include them today? Of course not. Paul isn't giving us an unbreakable command that we must include them. He's simply giving time-bound advice to a particular church about how to handle it in their context, because these things had become problematic. But then Paul also includes what seems like a command to prohibit women from ever speaking in churches. As in all churches of the saints, he says, women should be silent in the churches. And he does seem a bit more emphatic on this point. But really, he's still talking about things that are disruptive to good order. And it was simply the case in that day and age that women played a subservient role in society generally. His real point comes at the end, and it is based on the theological principle he gave above, for God is a God not of disorder, but of peace. Listen to how Paul finishes this section on worship. Anyone who claims to be a prophet or to have spiritual powers must acknowledge that what I am writing to you is a command of the Lord. Anyone who does not recognize this is not to be recognized. So, my friends, be eager to prophesy and do not forbid speaking in tongues, but in all things should be done decently and in order. All things should be done decently and in order. That's the principle at stake. And it is in service to the even higher principle that he's already been talking about, the building up of the church. For Paul, what serves to build up the church is to be valued. What serves to tear it down is to be avoided. So back to the Rorschach test. Does the presence of women in worship leadership today build up or tear down the church? I would argue that in our modern world, women, whose place in society generally, play an indispensable role in worship leadership, including the preaching of the gospel. Women no longer play a subservient role in our society. Paul's advice about women was time-bound and secondary. His real advice and the real principle at stake had little or nothing to do with women in the church. It was about things being done decently and in order. That principle continues to guide the church even today. Tomorrow, we begin a read through 1 Corinthians 15, a lengthy chapter. It also happens to be the longest treatment of the resurrection in the Bible. But for now, may God continue to bless you and keep you in all that you do this day and in all the days ahead.